Hi, everyone. Welcome to Unchained, your new hype resource for all things crypto. I'm your host, Laura Shin, a journalist with over 2 decades of experience. I started covering crypto 6 years ago, and as a senior editor at Forbes, was the first mainstream media reporter to cover cryptocurrency full-time. This is the November 23rd, 2021 episode of Unchained. My book, The Cryptopians, Idealism, Greed, Lies, and the Making of the First Big Cryptocurrency Craze, is available for pre-order on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Bookshop.org, or any of your other favorite bookstores. Go to bit.ly/cryptopians. That's bit.ly/CRYPTOPIANS and pre-order today. Buy, earn, and spend crypto on the Crypto.com app. New users can enjoy 0 credit card fees on crypto purchases in the first 30 days. Download the Crypto.com app and get $25 with the code LAURA, link in the description. The Nodal Cash app makes earning crypto on your smartphone as easy as turning on your Bluetooth. Nodal Cash is private, secure, and available on iOS and Android. Visit nodal.io/unchained. That's nodle.io/unchained to start earning Nodal Cash. Today's topic is tokenomics, aka crypto economics. Here to discuss are Yan Liberman, co-founder of Delphi Digital, and Viktor Bunin, protocol specialist at Coinbase Cloud, formerly known as Bison Trails. Welcome, Yan and Viktor.
Hey, so good to be here.
Thanks for having me.
Token designs are getting more diverse and more creative. But before we dive into the meat of the episode, let's just make sure everybody even really understands what we're talking about. Why don't each of you say what you think the definition of tokenomics is and why it's important? And Viktor, why don't we start with you?
Sure. So the way that I think about tokenomics is the ability to use incentive design to set the behaviors that you want and consistently accomplish them. Normally, this includes the use of a token, but it doesn't always have to. There's a lot of social pressures and other responsibilities and ethics and other cultural norms that also play into it.
And Yan, what about you?
Yeah, not to restate too much of what Viktor mentioned, but yeah, the idea is a token is a kind of a mechanism to organize a set of individuals where, if you assume that they all act in their own best interest or in a way that's most logical for them, how do you kind of organize that and combine that in a positive sum way to create value or kind of accomplish what you want to accomplish?
And so when people are designing these incentive mechanisms in tokens, what types of factors are they considering, whether it's things like fairness or liquidity or security or the developer ecosystem, or I'm sure there's plenty of other considerations, but what do you find that people are thinking about and tend to value for some of the different choices? Like maybe you could give some examples of how that either affects the community or affects the value of the token.
I think one of the most important things is for protocol teams or communities to first figure out like what it is that they're trying to accomplish and what their token specifically will be used for. And so in a lot of work token models, for example, such as LivePeer or Keep and NuCypher or the Graph, the token is used to provide a service. It's serving as a taxi medallion. And so there's an element of security there, but there's also an element of I am following the rules of the protocol and providing a service to specific specifications. And I want to be able to do that in a consistent way, but also punish folks that are breaking the rules of the protocol or not providing that service in a consistent way. And so that's going to be one of the first things that you think about is like, how does the token actually accomplish the goals of providing this useful work to an ecosystem of participants? And then all the other things get factored in afterwards, such as governance. What are we actually making decisions on? And who are the right people to make that decision? And how do you incentivize the right people to actually participate in the protocol in a way that scales beyond the protocol team, but encompasses everybody else that should be part of it? I'll pause here because I think Yan has done so much incredible work with protocol and token design that I'd love for him to chime in.
No, and again, yeah, really largely agree with everything you're kind of describing. It's really figuring out. So what are you trying to realistically accomplish, and how do you accomplish this? And then you basically start at the primitive of what is the goal, how do you get there, and so you start incentivizing certain elements of behavior around achieving this goal, and then afterwards it becomes kind of this very iterative process of understanding, all right, you can accomplish a goal this way, but with crypto everyone is or in crypto, there's a lot of very savvy actors. And so there's always going to be kind of exploits. And so the whole idea is, okay, yes, it's fairly easy to get someone to do something, but it's the difficult part is how to prevent all the other kind of potential negative actors or kind of value extractive actors where, just because you reward somebody for doing something and you get them to do something, that doesn't necessarily mean that this is a sustainable model or one that's kind of foolproof. So it's figuring out what you want them to do and then kind of figuring out how to prevent everyone else from extracting value in a way that doesn't necessarily, go in line with what you're doing. And at the same time, there's a lot of importance with the community, and the stickiness component is, so with crypto, unlike in other places, forks are very prevalent. And so if your protocol, and we see it mostly in DeFi, and that's part of the issue is there's a lot of kind of mercenary capital and mercenary behavior that can exist. And so, you take a step back and think, all right, not only do I need to figure out how to incentivize them to do something and prevent someone else from doing it, but how do I create some kind of stickiness, longevity, community? How do I create actual incentives for them to stick around other than kind of, pure tribalism, which it happens to work in certain communities, but it's often a byproduct of being very early, where individuals have made kind of life-changing money and a protocol. And so now they're tribalistically with it. But realistically, you have to assume most are going to be mercenary-esque to some extent. Obviously, there's a spectrum there, but it's realizing, all right, on top of that, how do I kind of prevent individuals from, accomplishing what I want them to accomplish, but then not kind of redoing that cycle elsewhere, because it's so easy to kind of fork what's been designed. And so I think that's been a fun learning process and just observational process with DeFi in particular, especially, over the past 2 years or so.
Yeah, in a way, it actually reminds me of kind of like a really basic thing that maybe parents sometimes deal with, where they're like, oh, should I try to incentivize my children to do, whatever, like chores or get good grades or, eat healthy or whatever, by either paying them or, rewarding them with like sweets or, whatever it might be. But then it's like, well, what's better is that you want them to intrinsically want to do those things rather than, trying to game the system in order to get the reward. So it becomes like what you're describing just reminds me of that. But so both of you have helped design or redesign various tokens. And I thought it might be fun for each of you to just pick one example that you would like to describe of a team that you helped. Maybe it was like they had a particular problem they were trying to solve, and like just walk us through why, you all made the choices that you made. And either one of you can go first. Maybe, I don't know if Yan, you want to, because I know Delphi is sort of known for this.
So yeah, I'd say like a popular one's Axie, but I think just because that one's been really overly discussed now, it would be more interesting to kind of talk about. So Astroport is a project that we're incubating heavily through Delphi Labs, and so it's a decentralized exchange that's on the Luna ecosystem, and so we've worked with a lot of various DeFi protocols, and both in terms of like a consulting capacity and just done plenty of research on them. And it's interesting, you see a decent amount of iteration. So there's kind of multiple innovation layers with DEXs, whether it's just the actual, AMMs, the automated market maker type, like a Uniswap, where, it started with this simple XYK model, and over time those have evolved, but there hasn't necessarily been as much evolution on the token design front. And so, we saw the first instances of the value of a token when the Sushi vampire attack happened, right? Where Uniswap was a dominant decentralized exchange, and then Sushi basically, was a fork of Uniswap, and then they were able to incentivize a token on top. And the whole idea is, come to our exchange and use it, and we'll give you tokens in reward for providing liquidity. And the idea is, if you provide the liquidity there, you kind of start the virtuous cycle of liquidity begets volume, which generates fees, which creates more liquidity. And so, that exists, but Sushi's had its own issues where the disconnect there was, and this is where the introduction of kind of like very mercenary-esque capital happened, where there was a disconnect between the users of the platform and the token itself. So as a token holder, you benefit from the fees on the platform, where basically by staking Sushi, you take a sixth of the fees that are generated on the platform. The issue there was you kind of have this dichotomy where the users of the platform, you have the traders and or the liquidity providers. there's no real reason for them to hold the token. And then you have the people that own the token, and they're just pure speculators that can benefit from upside there. And the loose agreement to some extent was basically, as sushi price appreciated, the value in terms of the rewards that they can use to incentivize behavior that would be value accretive to the platform increases, right? If I can give away one sushi, if it's worth, $1 versus $10, it goes a longer way with being at $10. So there was like this kind of, that was the dynamic. But once, it's very reflexive on the way up, but it's also can be very reflexive on the way down. Whereas price goes down, the way your ability to incentivize behavior, diminishes, and so then volume is less, or rather liquidity kind of disappeared, and so on and so forth. And so the gap there is you had this disconnect between the users that are participating on the network or using the platform and those that are holding the token. And so with Astroport, we're kind of trying to tackle that. And we're taking some tips. So Curve has an interesting model where you can use the token and lock it up to basically vote on rewards towards your pool. And so you're kind of seeing this with like Tokenomics as well, where owning the token you can stake the token and direct rewards to a pool. And so we're kind of combining a lot of elements there, where basically the design here is you have similar components where with sushi, you take sushi, you stake it into a pool, you get X sushi, which is a claim on that pool. And the idea is over time, the fees from the platform are used to buy back sushi, deposit it into the pool, and your X sushi over time is worth more sushi. So you deposit one sushi, you have one X sushi, and then over time you can withdraw that, like you can kind of redeem that X sushi for more than one. And so that's how like the value accrual exists. So we kind of take it a step further and basically allow you to take that X sushi and deposit it into, which is X Astro, deposit it into a voting contract. And the amount your vote is a function of how much you stake and how long you stake it for. And the idea there is, okay, what are you actually voting on? So with the fee structure, there's usually like a 30 bips like fee capture. And what we're basically doing is, rather than users pay 30 basis points, typically 25 would go to the liquidity providers and 5 goes to the protocol. So we're kind of lowering that a bit and doing 20 basis points to liquidity providers. So 5 base, and then 10 goes to the protocol. 5 goes to that similar X sushi, X Astro equivalent. And then kind of combining the Curve thought process, basically you can then stake your X Astro and you get this locked voting share. So the benefit there is, as a community, if you're providing, if you're a fan of a certain token and you have liquidity on Astro, the benefit now is the community holders want to be token holders because they can vote basically to direct a certain level of rewards to their individual pools. So basically, if you're a liquidity provider on Astro, it's in your best interest to also be an Astro token holder because you can direct a certain amount of vote towards your pool. And then like kind of taking that a step further, if you have, let's say 15 pools, there's obviously gonna be a lot more, but let's say you have 15 pools that want to participate in order of voting rank. If you're number 9 versus number 10, your incremental value of voting from 10 to 9. And so the idea is, your share of rewards is a function of your share of the vote. If you're in 9th place or 10th place, there's no real incentive to participate, or like there's no like additional incentive to participate. It's just like a very micro level vote. And so we've introduced kind of like a list that gradually expands. And so if you don't make the cut, you are effectively you're missing out on the rewards. But if you're in this like top 8 list, so basically you're always going to have a lot of competition at the high end because there's going to be a lot of kind of, the very popular pools are always going to be, they're going to have larger communities, but it's the smaller communities that are often forgotten. But here you're kind of creating a lot of incentive for them to participate because, coming in 8th means you're actually going to get, so 8th in a scenario where all 15 participate, you're getting a lot less. 8 in a scenario where only top 8 participate, you're getting a lot more. And also going from 8 to 9 is a massive drop off because you don't actually participate in any of the kind of the rewards. And then there's a lot of kind of additional attack vectors that exist with kind of like convex and kind of like hijacking of governance. And so I don't want to kind of hog up the entire conversation, but that's one area where, what we like to do is basically, observe what works, read about it, figure out why it doesn't work, and then try and kind of iterate and combine different facets and potentially introduce some of our own. And that's kind of like the thought process behind a lot of the token design that we work on.
It sounds super interesting. And wait, when is this going to launch?
We can talk about it here as well, but the launch mechanism is one we're really excited about as well, because it kind of addresses some of the issues with distribution. And yeah, I can take a pause before going into that. But so that's going to launch the first part. It's a 3-stage process, but it'll start on December 6th.
Huh. Okay. Yeah, we'll circle back to that about the launch. But one other thing that actually I meant to say a while back was earlier when you just described Uniswap as XYK, for people who maybe are new or don't understand, that's just like the equation that is used to, kind of maintain the price in each liquidity pool. So, the price of each token should always equal this constant K, or when you multiply the two of them. All right. So it's super interesting. And yeah, I think there's like plenty we can unpack from there. But Viktor, why don't you pick one token design that you want to walk us through?
I had the pleasure of actually working on the first decentralized protocol merge between NuCypher and Keep networks. At Bison Trails, we are essentially just a blockchain infrastructure provider, and we support both of those protocols. And they both provide cryptographic services for folks that are interacting with them. And the fascinating thing there is that they started off with different use cases. And that NuCypher started off with proxy encryption, and Keep Network started off with Random Beacon, which is essentially a random number generator, and some other services as well. And what we saw is that they were increasingly going to go and compete against one another in specific use cases. And so because I was very close to both of the teams, and we were able to start having conversations around what could potential merger look like. And I ended up being one of the leads of the proposals that actually went through governance and was voted on and accepted for how to merge the two protocols and the two communities into a single community and a single protocol. And one of the interesting things there is that it's one, there's no playbook or roadmap. It is incredibly, incredibly hard to do a merger of equals because of all of the, different places that each protocol is in, and different token distributions and different incentive designs that they have, and different, considerations around, inflation and whatnot. And so one of the things that was a big priority for me is actually, two bits. The first bit was around how do you design for what the network will look like in its ultimate state? And that was crucial because when we talked about earlier about work token models, is that they're providing services. And the nice thing about cryptographic services is that you can provide them in a modular fashion. And that you say, okay, here's the building block, and what this does is proxy encryption. And here, and this does some zero knowledge stuff, or here, this does some homomorphic encryption, and so on. And so what you can do is you can actually opt into these services, and you can provide some or all of them, depending on what your preferences are, as a node operator. And so one of the important things of the incentive model is you want to be able to direct incentives to encourage node operators to provide certain services that you think it's important for the network to do. And so as a really specific example, soon the new network is going to be called Threshold. It's actually launching, I believe, sometime next month, which is going to be really exciting. And on it is going to launch something called TBTC, which is the version 2 of it. And you obviously want this TBTC, which is a decentralized Bitcoin. You want people to adopt it. You want people to support it and provide that service. And so that's going to be probably one of the things that the community is going to vote to incentivize. And so you have a bunch of these nodes like, hey guys, we need a lot of nodes to make this successful. We need it to be super decentralized. We need for there to be a lot of support for it. And therefore, we're going to direct more of the rewards towards that use case rather than other ones, for example, that are less of a priority for the ecosystem. So that's like the first thing around how do you make sure that the actual work itself gets done and is incentivized. The second part, and this is quite challenging, is that when you have these two token amounts and two communities and two whatever, how do you actually get them to use a single token? Like, what is a fair way to do it, right? Is it based off of the value of each token? Is it based off, the quantities and whatnot? And if you say, okay, the NuCypher team will get 60% because their market cap is larger than the Keep side, and they only get 40%, they're not going to be happy, right? The Keep token holders are going to hold a grudge. That's what we were very fortunate that the market caps were fairly close together. The stages of the life cycle were fairly close together, and therefore we could have done it, and we did do it as a merger of equals, where each token holder base got exactly half of the token distribution. And then you can map that using token factors essentially to convert, go from one to the other. But for the future, when there's going to be token mergers, I think a lot of them are going to look like acquisitions more than mergers, and that there's going to be greater disparities between the teams, and it's going to be less of a merger of equals and more of a one team subsuming the other. One of the nice things about Threshold is that now it sets it up so that new teams can actually join the network, in that Ethereum is the only protocol out there that has like multiple clients that are in active development. And Threshold is going to be one of the only work token models that's also going to have multiple client teams and the ability to add more client teams as other folks want to come and add modular cryptographic services, and then petition the community to say, hey, like you should adopt this and you should fund it and you should direct incentive rewards to go towards the service that we're providing, so that node operators adopt it and provide it to the community. So it was really cool to work on it, and I'm excited to see more mergers in the near future amongst other protocols.
Yeah. I think that will become a bigger thing. And obviously we did see in terms of one involving, two protocols that were maybe less equal was obviously the Polygon and Hermes, or I don't know how to pronounce it, deal. But actually, let's now talk about a big change in tokenomics that happened for Ethereum, which obviously is one of the biggest. It's the second biggest protocol, which I'm sure everybody knows. So in April, they adopted EIP 1559, which started burning the base fee. And obviously we've seen that this has now led to ETH being deflationary at times, sometimes like for, kind of a decent amount of time, which is fascinating. Just, and that's being driven by things like NFTs and stuff like that. But I was curious for your opinion on kind of those changes and how well you think that design has played out and will continue to play out for Ethereum, especially as it transitions to the final merge for Ethereum 2.0.
Yeah, so actually, I took a look at this yesterday, so I have some really, really fresh metrics on it. So thus far, EIP 1559 has reduced the net Ethereum issuance by about 2/3, which is a really significant cut. And while Ethereum still is inflationary from that perspective, if Ethereum were to switch over to the merge today, it would actually be fairly significantly deflationary. And I think that it has actually a couple of really interesting impacts, some of them that are shorter term and some of them that are longer term. In the shorter term, EIP 1559 is like catnip to institutional investors, because Ethereum makes a lot of sense to them, and that they say, okay, this is a thing that you can build on, and it has use cases and applications and yada, yada, yada. And also, before people would say, well, how is ETH going to capture any of this upside? It has no mechanism. And, folks that have been around in the industry for a long time realize that if something is useful, it's going to be valuable, right? And that's what happened with Ethereum. But as new folks and especially institutions enter the space, and now they can say, okay, well, we can actually model the cash flows and the impact of these activities and what this does to the supply of it and how that could potentially impact price. That becomes like a really attractive narrative for them to latch onto. And this is combined at the same time with the merge occurring with the ability to stake Ethereum. And so now you have ETH that is this, revenue generating quote unquote asset that you're able to provide security with, earn rewards on, and you're able to see how the supply of it will change over time. And you can like model all that against your income as a validator. And so I think from that perspective, in the short term, that is why I think a lot of enterprises, institutions, and funds are extremely excited about Ethereum, where we've seen such inflows into the ecosystem from that perspective. In the long term, though, I'm a little bit, maybe a little bit concerned, in that I think the nice thing about Ethereum is that you want people to spend it. You want people to use it. I don't think it's meant to be something that you just sit on and wait for it to appreciate. And when you have something that's deflationary, one of the core characteristics of it is that you're expecting for it to go up in value. But if you're expecting for something to go up in value, you have less desire to spend it. And while that may be great for currencies like Bitcoin, I don't think that's the right framework for something that is meant to be used and is meant to pay for gas and is meant to fuel this economy, which is ETH's role. And so from that perspective, I think I'm super bullish on EIP 1559 in terms of its impact on Ethereum. But I think long term, one of the things we're going to come to is to figure out like where that inflationary versus deflationary kind of like direction has to end up in order for us to accomplish our goals of making something that's really useful for people.
Yan, do you want to add anything?
Yeah. No, I think those are all really good points. Crypto is probably one, if not the most like reflexive thing I've really ever come across. And I think so. If you look at the net issuance or the kind of net inflation relative to the change, it's not that seismic, right? If you think about it on like in terms of the amount that's being burned relative to the size of the entire kind of the entire protocol, but the narrative is very, very strong, and like Viktor mentioned, it's very digestible for people who are used to seeing buybacks, and it's like, oh, I can think of it akin to this, and so it becomes very digestible and familiar, and so that's very massive. And then the other thing is, if you go to this like kind of net deflationary narrative, then it goes from, all right, this just becomes something that I can kind of use as a random currency that I'm not really looking to sit on, to, all right, I'm happy using this as a form of collateral to borrow against, or kind of holding this as some form of store of value. And so I think what ends up happening is that in the similar way that Bitcoin's finite supply is what really is part of what strengthens its store of value narrative, I think this deflationary kind of component also strengthens the store of value narrative for Ethereum. And so I get the apprehension for, I think that's a super fair point where, eventually it could come back to bite you a bit, where, part of it is meant to be spent. But I think realistically, Ethereum pre being deflationary still could have been easily considered a store of value, because, the incremental difference in that issuance or burn isn't that massive. It's only really seen over the course of many, many years. But this net deflationary kind of component, that's where the reflexivity comes in. It's like, okay, this is net deflationary. We think there's going to be more adoption, so we think this will only be increasingly more net deflationary. So I'm very comfortable using this as a store of value. Oh man, others are using this as a store of value, so I will as well. And so it's like this small shift that just kind of loops and loops, and it like reverberates through the like communities, holders, and investor mindset. And so I do think that, like, obviously the concern of people not wanting to spend something, like, the idea of, and that's why I don't think Bitcoin will ever be this, global like currency. It's just, that's not what it is, or at least, from my opinion. But the interesting thing with ETH is that, like, I think the net spend on gas for most people is negligible. So, if you're spending it, and so it's like, what else are you really spending it on? No one's really going out and buying cars with ETH. You're buying other things in the crypto community with ETH, whether that be NFTs or I mean, NFTs being a big thing, and then NFTs is obviously like a massive subsector, whether it's in games or just art. But most of those things end up being priced in ETH as well. And so to that respect, most people are going to be comfortable spending it because you're still kind of exposed to it. But like, yeah, the gas component is obviously an interesting one in terms of spend. But, in bull markets, people are clearly comfortable spending just obnoxious amounts on it, as evidenced by the burns that we see during these NFT mints and things along those lines.
Huh. Okay. Yeah. I mean, it's going to be a really fascinating thing to see play out. I mean, I think your point that against the total supply, the burn is small, may be what will offset that desire to hodl rather than spend. But I think we won't really know until it happens. Yeah. I guess the one thing that I like about EIP 1559 is it does, just tie together so much more closely usage and demand with the price, which just seems like intuitively how it should be, right? If something is being widely used, it should be valuable, and then therefore that should cause the price to go up. But you're right that then it kind of has these other knock-on effects. So we'll just have to see how that plays out.
Even to that, it kind of like shifts the value from value flowing to miners to, value flowing a bit more to the protocol as a whole. Whereas before it was pocketed by them, and now it kind of just reduces the supply, which is more kind of socializing the benefit.
Yeah. It widens that. I love that, actually. That totally makes sense. Okay, so in a moment, we're going to talk about all kinds of other issues and problems that come up due to token design. But first, a quick word from the sponsors who make this show possible. With Nodal Cash, you can earn crypto on your mobile device for free with no hardware to purchase. You just download the Nodal Cash app, turn on your Bluetooth, and start earning. Nodal Cash is private, secure, and easy to earn, whether you're on the go, stuck in traffic, or even while you're sleeping. You can even repurpose your old smartphones to earn Nodal Cash. Visit nodal.io/unchained to get started. That's nodle.io/unchained. Join the Citizen Network to earn crypto on your smartphone 24/7. Join over 10 million people using Crypto.com, the easiest place to buy, earn, and spend over 150 cryptocurrencies. New users enjoy zero credit card fees on crypto purchases in their first 30 days. With Crypto.com Earn, you can get industry-leading interest rates of up to 8.5% on over 40 coins, including Bitcoin, and earn up to 14% on stablecoins. With the Crypto.com Visa card, you can spend your crypto anywhere. Enjoy up to 8% cash back instantly, plus 100% rebates for your Netflix, Spotify, and Amazon Prime subscriptions, and zero annual fees. Download the Crypto.com app and get $25 with the code LAURA. Link in the description. Back to my conversation with Yan and Viktor. So we did see a couple of issues recently with a couple of popular airdrops. One was ENS, the Ethereum name service airdrop. And, people, which, I think this happens all the time, but again, people were gaming the system. So do you want to kind of describe what happened there, what the problem was, and then how you guys think maybe it could have been resolved differently or better?
Yeah. So one of the challenges there was that somebody had either leaked or figured out or somehow optimized their bot to spin up a whole bunch of new Ethereum addresses, put some ETH into them, register ENS names, and make sure that they set all the parameters correctly. And either through inside knowledge or some sort of luck or determination, they managed to secure themselves what would have been a very sizable airdrop amount of ENS tokens because they met all the eligibility criteria in order to maximize that. And it's one of those things where the community spotted it early, and they gave feedback to the team that these addresses were engaging in this behavior. The team reviewed the behavior of those accounts and also other accounts as part of the list of accounts that were going to be receiving the airdrop, and banned, actually I don't remember the exact number, maybe about 1,500 addresses from the list. So they blacklisted them. And so those addresses did not receive any token airdrops. And, some folks have different opinions about it, but I think that what it kind of boils down to is, and I think a lot of things actually tie indirectly back to whether or not you think code is long and whether or not you're supposed to apply it, equally to absolutely everybody, regardless of whether or not they're a good actor or a bad actor. And I fundamentally disagree with that. In circumstances like this, nobody's entitled to an airdrop. Nobody's entitled to receive, not only free money, but also a say in how the network is going to govern itself and spend its funds and otherwise incentivize adoption and so on. And so I think it's not only optional, I think it's a responsibility of every protocol team considering doing an airdrop to be thoughtful about who they're dropping the tokens to, and to intentionally comb through the list of accounts and see, are these real users? Are these people that are going to be contributing, or are these people that are malicious or that are vultures or that are value extractive? Because when we think about it, you don't start a company or a family or a school based off of whoever's around, right? Like you don't do it through this random chance of like whoever shows up, right? It's like, all right, guess we're doing this together. You're intentional about it. Why? Because if you're bringing in people that are bad actors, not only does it like unfairly benefit them, but it also hurts the good actors. And they see that people that are bad actors are getting money and they're getting benefits, and they're doing that in a way that is making people that are good actors and do try to like play by the rules like feel really negatively about it. So I'm 100% in support of what the ENS team did, and I look forward to other teams doing that and also much more to make sure that they're airdropping tokens in a way that's very targeted and very intentional and truly accomplishes the goals that they set out to do.
Yeah, and actually, before Jan weighs in, something kind of similar happened with Paraswap, and I just wondered in general, because what ENS did to resolve it was a retroactive solution, but I wondered also if you guys had ideas on how airdrops could be designed ahead of time to not fall victim to these bots that are trying to farm the airdrop, because with Paraswap, their estimate was that some people were deploying literally tens of thousands of bots, which is that's a lot. So I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I have a quick thought, and then I'd love to pass it over to Yan. I think one of the things, and this may be like important to comment on, is that just like we were talking about with token design earlier, with airdrop design, you have to have a specific goal in mind of what you're trying to do. And there's a couple of like high level goals that people should try to accomplish, or probably are trying to accomplish. And one of them is going to be, give folks skin in the game, or like the people that you actually want to continue to stay part of the ecosystem, that have been providing value and being active. The other bit is you want to obviously incentivize early users and people that have helped you get to where you are. And the third thing is that you want to think about, how do you treat this as a customer acquisition cost? Not only to acquire your existing customers, but also continue acquiring customers long into the future. So you're not turning people off by saying, okay, like only a small subsection of people will get it and other people won't. And so I think that with folks like Paraswap, they did, I think, a generally a good job on their airdrop, in that they were super targeted. They knew exactly who they wanted to get in there, and they got those people in. But the mistake that they made was that it wouldn't have cost them a lot to get all the other users that aren't bots and just to give them a little bit of skin in the game and give them a quick thank you. You don't have to make those people very rich, but you should acknowledge that they helped you get to where you are in a way that doesn't then make them salty about not having received anything at all. And so I think that was one of the mistakes that they made. And so when you think about like what ultimately drives a good airdrop design, I think more and more what it's going to come to is identity. And that identity can be done in like a super reputation-based way and your activities and whatever. But honestly, I think identity is going to be done the identity way of saying, okay, how do we tie back like real world identifiers to whether it's ENS or one of these other things? Because what you want ultimately is you want a proof of uniqueness, a proof of identity, or proof of humanness. And then when you have that in some variation, you're able to be much more intentional about, okay, this is a person that's super active and they do all this governance and all this activity, and therefore we want them to be participating in governance activity on our protocol as well. And like, boom, you can do that. Or this person's a whale, but they're like a long-term whale versus a short-term whale. And so you started being able to be like really granular by getting the right people in the door. So I think we're getting there. There's decentralized efforts, obviously, but I think centralized ones will always also get us like part of the way there. So we'll just see which one of those like takes off first and actually gets adoption by enough users to make it worthwhile to use it to target.
Jan?
I couldn't agree more with basically everything Viktor said. Yeah, the issue is obviously the parasitic participants. It's a double whammy, right? Where they're not only are they extracting value, but they're making the value that you gave to everyone else also worse, and just kind of they're kind of hitting you on both ends, where they shouldn't be getting it, and now those that got it are worse off than if the people that shouldn't be getting it even got it in the first place. And so it's certainly a problem. And so I very much agree that this identity kind of situation is certainly going to be one that's going to be more on the forefront, where we're very bullish on the idea of on-chain identity, and so in that you can provably verify what an individual's participation has been over the past X amount of time, and you can pretty not easily but quickly kind of get a rough quantifiable idea of how much value they can really provide to your protocol as well. And so you can be a lot more kind of targeted, in particular with your airdrops. And so like one of the things we're actually working on is this kind of NFT primitive, where you'll be able to effectively kind of customize your NFTs based on rewards you've gotten, and those rewards are a function of your participation in various protocols. And so you'll have these kind of like, you can basically combine a shell with different, whether it's different details. So it can be like imagine like a PFP that iterates and evolves over time based on what you've accomplished. And so it's a way, there's a public side where you can obviously show off like, oh man, this guy was a massive whale here and he was one of the first LPs here, and so that's super valuable, both in terms of just elevating the kind of the status of your PFP that wasn't just a function of you spending a bunch or getting lucky with a mint. It's actually work you've done, and at the same time, it's potentially a way to also identify valuable participants in ecosystem, and then you can you can do this across chains, right? Like if this exists, you can monitor these valuable participants across chains, and now with bridging and kind of how easy it is to move across them, you can bring liquidity, bring users, bring these power users, or really get targeted with these airdrops, because otherwise it can be a massive waste in terms of customer acquisition costs, and then a poor airdrop just really sets you on poor footing to begin with, where it just shouldn't be a disadvantage you really need to deal with. There's a lot of obviously other things that you need to target, and so part of a good airdrop is also having good token design going forward, where, all right, yes, you rewarded a certain user, but then is there a reason for them to actually hold it beyond just being a fan and thinking number go up? Or, is there a way for them to use it to actually interact with the protocol, and whether that's through through governance, through monetary benefits, it really depends on kind of what the protocol does. But yeah, it all really starts with a quality airdrop and then quality kind of integrations afterwards.
Yeah. And actually, just to go back to this identity issue, because I also, as I was even just writing the questions for this, I was like, oh gosh, I feel like until we have blockchain-based identities, then this is going to be a problem. But I came across a blog post that Anil, what's his last name? Anil Lula. Okay, right.
Yeah.
At Delphi, he wrote about how one resolution would be to link reputation to yield. And is that what you're talking about? Just like seeing, certain addresses participated in these various protocols in different ways? Is that how he's defining reputation?
To some extent, I think you can have more objective metrics where it's black and white. Did you participate, and to what extent? And you can quantify that without any real subjectivity. The reputation component is a really interesting one, because it's, when you're thinking about like token design, it's, all right, how do I really keep someone incentivized through participation, or like how do I create some level of stickiness? And in the early days, it was always financial, and that's tough, because that's often zero sum, in the sense that if I'm giving you extra financial benefits, it usually comes at the expense of someone else or the protocol or something like that. Whereas with reputation, that can be its own community-based kind of element, in the sense that reputation can be granted by others to others within the community. And so you have this like natural filter of the people who know the most are actually able to distribute the most reputation. But obviously there's ways to gamify that. And so you constantly have to kind of think through these loops and really ensure that there aren't really these attack vectors, because, as good as design can be, if there's a way to exploit it and it breaks, it really diminishes all the value that's been built up previously. And so, but yeah, we're very bullish on the idea of kind of reputation within DAOs, within ecosystems, to allow those who are actually, knowledgeable, really contributing a lot to kind of rise to the top. And then that becomes, healthier for all participants, where, I think with DAOs, especially as they get really large, you're going to have this free rider problem. And that can be very parasitic, but to be able to really incentivize and reward the people that are actually delivering the most value ends up being, very useful for everyone involved.
Yeah, and if I can chime in, just one other thing there is that, one of the things, going back to your point earlier about kids having extrinsic and intrinsic motivation, I think one of the conclusions that we're going to have to come to as an industry is, right now we're trying like very hard to make things as extrinsic as possible, and that everything's happening on chain, and it's on chain reputation, on chain contributions, and you can look at your activity. But I think the reality is that, especially as like these DAOs and organizations need to scale, you're going to have a lot of soft reputation. You're going to have a lot of intrinsic motivations. You're going to have like a lot of the stuff that happens off chain, because you're ultimately dealing with humans coordinating with other humans. And so it seems like right now, one of the things that we're doing is we're saying, okay, how far can we push it in the direction of everything on chain, everything extrinsic? And then from there, you kind of walk it back and you say, okay, you can't have everything be on chain and extrinsic. Which parts do we need to have be off chain and intrinsic and a little bit softer?
Okay. Yeah. I think probably in a way already we're seeing there's going to be like a big mix of designs. But that also now takes me, because we've been talking about these airdrops where like the protocol has already launched, but they're kind of like retroactively rewarding users. And I wanted to ask about like launching coins. As I'm sure you're well aware, there's this tension between the fair launch coins and the VC coins. And that goes back to this, question that has been, for forever in crypto, even like before I started covering this 6 years ago, which is the issue of like, pre-mine or no pre-mine. And of course, now that also raises questions around like vesting and lockups. And I'm wondering if you guys have an opinion on all that, like if you think it's always better to just try to do the fair launch thing, or whether you think a pre-mine ever could make sense, and if so, how that should be designed.
So thinking about doing, I guess, like fair launch versus, VC investors, as someone who is a VC investor, like naturally, I guess there would be some inherent bias, but, realistically, we're always trying to think of what's the best approach here. And I think the biggest issue is that thinking that it has to be binary, having VCs that are actually builders and helping contribute to what you're designing can be very useful versus, I think what we sometimes see is just, in the same way you have mercenary capital in these launch strategies, you also have mercenary kind of VCs that are just, investing in a bunch of places and don't really have the capacity to add value besides just, the capital they provide. And so I do think to some extent having the right investors is more valuable than not. But I get the idea from those that aren't investing from their perspective that, it isn't fair in terms of what's being delivered. So ideally, the idea is that bringing these investors on board actually ends up being more value accretive than not. And so, you're owning a smaller slice of a larger pie is kind of the idea. And so you always want it to be fair. And it's just like, what is the definition of fair? To some, I think it started with a bit with Wi-Fi, and the idea is fair is it has to start with zero and everyone kind of minds. But, at the same time, is it fair that the people that found out about it in the first 24 or 48 hours are going to just farm you by a larger extent? And then does it really become fair? And so I think we've seen the definition of fair kind of gradually evolve. And I think fair ends up being, a very public pre-announced distribution plan where you explain each component, why everyone has the ability to participate, and their participation actually adds value to what you're trying to build or what mechanism you're trying to design. And so I think, fair has shifted where previously it was just zero investors, first people in are starting to get it, to, all right, it's fair in the sense that you're not going to have people who can code in Solidity snipe, or you're not going to have people who can code snipe out the initial drop. And fair is now what's the most equitable way to distribute, where certain people aren't disadvantaged because they're not as technically savvy or they didn't hear about it in a small chat first. And so I think the definition of fair has really evolved, and ideally that's kind of where we sit in terms of that kind of conversation.
Yeah. So it's interesting. If I can actually maybe push back on the question a little bit, in that I actually think that's the wrong question to ask, in that we've seen super decentralized token launches that are from zero, and Yearn is a good example, or Grin, for example, in the layer one space. And we've seen super centralized token launches, right? Where a ton of the supply is held by insiders. And I think one of the things that we're coming to the conclusion of is that they obviously impact how successful a protocol is going to be, but it is not necessarily resulting in a more or less successful protocol just from that. And what we found is it's kind of random, right? How successful the protocol will be, whether or not it launched, fairly or unfairly, quote unquote. I think the better question, and this is something that nobody's been able to answer so far, is how do you continue distributing a token over its lifetime in a way that is fair? And that, I think, is the hard part. Right now, the closest thing that we have is okay, you're going to do liquidity mining, right? And then if you're a liquidity provider, you will continue getting some tokens. And that's kind of the V1 of it. But, the other question is, how do you continue to incentivize, people that participate in governance, and people that add value, and people that are thoughtful, and, companies that are, adopting it or building partnerships for it or tooling for it or whatever. And so those are the questions that we really need to answer. And right now it's done in a little bit of a crude way. And now you have a one-off governance proposal to, let's give this person a grant, or let's fund this marketing effort or whatever. But these are oftentimes one, not utilized enough, and two, they're kind of crude. And really what you want is you want to find a way to continue deploying a treasury, continue to deploying inflation, and continue to incentivize people to do value additive things that distribute the token more and more widely over time to the right people doing the right things. That's the part that nobody's really been able to answer, and is also in a lot of ways independent of whether or not the token was fairly launched or unfairly launched. And I think one of the things that we've seen is that you can have a pretty small token launch, but then you have, quote unquote, a theoretically unlimited amount of time that these things will be live for, right? They can go on forever. And so based off what you started and then what you do, it really starts to compound. And that's the area that we need to be focused on.
Yeah, well, so talk about that. Like, what do you think is the optimal way to, structure a liquidity mining program? Because as you guys have talked about throughout the episode, you don't want to attract this mercenary capital that is just going to leave you once the rewards, taper off or whatever it is. So, what are your thoughts?
It's really about rewarding the users that are. It's a combination of rewarding users that are going to be interacting with your protocol, and then also having a way for them to do so, right? So, and not to pick on Sushi here, but just like we were already on the topic, but so like they had an awesome initial kind of distribution situation, and it's a very successful vampire attack. The idea was for the rewards that you got, 1/3 you'd get up front, and then 2/3 would vest over time. And so that worked in two ways, where initially it was very reflexive on the way up, very reflexive on the way down, where I'm providing liquidity, I'm getting this yield, and I can only sell 1/3 of it. So I'm seeing a large number come in, and I can only really liquidate a smaller portion of it. And then, so what happens is, a lot of liquidity, because now number continues to go up. And so, it gets very reflexive. But then the kind of the subsequent headwind is that after this mercenary capital has realistically left, they farmed it, and there's potentially another farm. And that's kind of the issue with DeFi in general, where it can be very mercenary, where, okay, I'll fork it, and now how do I compete on a natural level when somebody else can just fork and then create a new wave of incentives? And so that kind of happened. And then you started to see the unlocks come in, and the unlocks were now given to people who are probably no longer providing liquidity. So now, they're not really adding much value, but they're contributing to a decent amount of kind of selling. And so, yeah, it ends up being very bullish on the way up, but very, negative on the way down. So the idea is you have to kind of understand, you want to introduce enough supply into the market where it's enough to reward people, not enough where you're basically overpaying, because, like Viktor mentioned, all of this is effectively customer acquisition costs. And so if you're overpaying, it can be, it can considerably, weigh down the protocol as a whole, where if you're over rewarding certain activities that aren't necessarily as valuable as the rewards you're giving, it's, net negative. And so that's kind of one thing to keep in mind. And then the other is understanding, all right, these are users who, once they receive the token, in that situation, they can either sell it or stake it, and with the expectation of number going up, but there aren't really additional benefits outside of that. But when you kind of start to introduce ways for them to continuously benefit from the ownership of the token, it's basically you want your customers to also be your token holders, rather than distinguishing the two. And so when you distinguish the two, you have to kind of provide separate incentives to some extent. But if you can overlap them, I think the incentives themselves become much more effective, because it's not purely just cash. It's actually a valuable asset that they're getting that they can leverage to receive further benefits. And so it's really just all kind of boils down to this game of incentive alignment.
So I don't know if this is a little bit of a hot take. I'll let you guys be the judge of that. But I think we should assume that liquidity providers are always going to be mercenary capital. Like, when we think about who has the most liquidity in the world, it's always going to be investors and institutions and money managers, like large institutional players. And what do those people care about? They care about yield, right? And from that perspective, I think it makes sense to think of them as always just optimizing for yield. And there will be a component of, I think this network will grow, and I think all this stuff, but treat them all as mercenaries. And so then what does that mean? Well, what it means is that what we currently think of liquidity mining programs in terms of let's give money to liquidity providers, I think it should be flipped on its head, and that really what you want to optimize for is usage. Because if you have a lot of usage, right, the fees that are being generated by the protocol will be high, which will be the incentive for liquidity providers to come and say, hey, right now it's paying out 20%. I'm willing to accept a rate of as low as 10%. And so I'm going to put a ton of liquidity into here until the rate hits what I'm willing to accept. And so from that perspective, I think that nobody's really figured out how to do that yet, because one crude way that we've seen is you say, okay, I'm going to incentivize the borrowing, or I'm going to incentivize the trading, but you can just game that, right? That's the whole point. And especially as fees drop on things like layer twos or rollups or whatnot, it's going to be easier and easier to game it. So the question is, how do you incentivize the kind of like ungameable actual adoption and usage of this protocol? And nobody knows yet, and nobody knows how to do that in a decentralized and trustless way. One of the shortcuts to it is you say, okay, maybe we form a partnership with Dharma or with Argent, and we're like, hey, route all your stuff in here, and we'll give you, some, a kickback, or it'll be subscription, or it'll be something. That's obviously in a centralized way, and so it's not a perfect way. In a perfect world, we'd like to find a decentralized way to do it. And I think that's going to be like whichever protocol figures out how to do that, how to incentivize the actual like usage and partnerships and collaborations, is going to do really well, and then the liquidity will follow that.
So we're running out of time, and I literally have ditched so many questions because like we can just go so deep on any one of these topics. But I did want to ask about NFTs, and maybe what I'll do is actually just quickly sneak in this last question that kind of is a takeoff what you just said. But like, I wonder if more of this will be about kind of like identity and community as time goes on, as we're kind of seeing in the NFT world. And the reason that I say that was I'm pretty sure that I heard this on an episode of Frank Chaparro's The Scoop podcast, where he was interviewing. So I don't remember who it was, but I think it was like somebody from Gem Capital, and they were talking about how like, which in the traditional financial world, it's like all about keeping things close to your vest. But then they were saying that now, if for their crypto activities, they are trying to get involved in governance and in the community and like being more transparent. The way that he was describing it just sort of seemed like it was almost like they were like creating this identity for themselves in this space, right? And, when you're watching things like what's happening with the NFT world with Bored Ape Yacht Club, where, they gave the Bored Ape owners, the rights to make derivative works and things like that. And then now we're seeing like all these new projects coming out of that. So I'm wondering if like that is how you kind of make it more organic. But I'm curious for your thoughts and any other thoughts you want to say about designing NFTs, because, to incentivize kind of like the value there.
Yeah. Well, I think that what it boils down to, and so at Bison Trails, I'm part of maybe like 40 or 50 different protocol communities at this point. And so we've seen all the different iterations of going from a testnet to incentivized testnet to mainnet, and how all these different ecosystems come up. And the thing that keeps sticking out in the protocol space, whether I'm looking at layer 1 or layer 2 or interop or DeFi or NFT, is that community is a killer feature. It's that simple, and people try to complicate it, but it's not complicated. Community is a killer feature. And so when we think about design and when we think about community, management, the driving force behind it should be, how do you create a community of leaders that act as owners, that have the agency and ability to go and do like what they want to do in order to add value? And there's a degree of trust there, right? Because if you're empowering people so much, you're saying, hey, we're trusting you to do the right thing with this power that you have. And a lot of brands are very afraid of that. But what we're seeing in the Bored Ape Yacht Club community is that these are folks that are extremely excited to be part of this cohesive community, and they want to do things that not only make the brand better, but they also have a lot of fun doing together. And so from that perspective, I think it's, they've done like a truly incredible job. I'm a Bored Ape NFT owner myself as well, just I guess to give that disclosure. But I also think, having said that is the V1, in that we haven't seen it go poorly yet. At some point, somebody's going to, take their ability to do this and do something pretty nefarious with it, right? Or they're going to do something that's, very not safe for work or whatever it is. And so it'll be up to the community to figure out like, where are those guardrails and what are we willing to tolerate, both at the like extrinsic level of like what you're allowed to do or not allowed to do based on, the agreements that you have, but also the intrinsic level of, are you a good community member? What are we, welcoming as part of the community, and what are we not? And so I think the NFT space is probably going to be pushing the DeFi space forward quite a bit in terms of that culture and in terms of that community, in terms of that intrinsic stuff. And I think ultimately what we're going to see is that a lot of the DeFi folks have NFTs, and a lot of the NFT folks have DeFi. And so I think these designs are going to like really build upon each other to make what is going to be really powerful communities that can withstand shocks and withstand black swans and withstand a lot of stuff and really thrive with powerful community members.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, largely agree that those two are massively overlapping now in terms of just like an ownership basis, but the functionality still hasn't really seen as much of an overlap as it certainly will in the coming months and years. And so, yeah, that's kind of part of the thought process behind the kind of the NFT standard that we're helping design. But also, I think one thing you're actually starting to see is the value of a governance token within these NFT communities, where part of sometimes you're starting to see it as like basically NFT communities are airdropping a token. Sometimes for weaker failing ones, it's just like a cash grab thing, which it's inevitable. Like that's just a kind of like a function of the space. But in the healthy and thriving ones, it's just another kind of way to coordinate and organize the community, where you can also leverage reputation on top of that as well, which would be more merit based than an airdrop, which is just purely based on how many you own or some kind of derivative of that. And so I think what we'll start to see is basically some kind of meta layer of governance that's orchestrated around a token or reputation that is used to really organize these. Because I really agree that the community is the hardest thing to build. It can't be manufactured. It can't be really incentivized purely. It has to be organic. There has to be some reason why people want to spend their time there. It's not something like I'm here I'm not idly farming this. I'm actually contributing my own time and going out of my way. And so, community is definitely the hardest thing to really build. And so it's going to be natural that as these communities grow, and in order to really maintain some level of organization, there needs to be something that they can use between them, whether it's token or reputation to organize it all.
Yeah, and sorry for chiming in again, but just the last point there is that Bored API Club did announce they're going to do a token, and they probably will be airdropped, or I don't know if a part of it will be sold. Doesn't matter. But I think one of the interesting things there is that you have a culture that's constantly doing things, that's organizing parties and getting celebrities to do stuff, or getting partnerships or sponsors, whatever, right? And the interesting thing is that once you have a token, is there going to be a finite amount of it? Or will there be some inflationary component? And if there is an inflationary component, how do you as a community figure out what you want to incentivize, not only the types of activities, but also the specific individuals? And there's a lot there to unpack, is that you don't want it to be a popularity contest, but also like people that are going to be doing good work are going to be well known. And so how do you do that in a way that people feel is fair and that people are bought into the process? And now you're starting to get into this really like interesting poli-sci democracy like characteristics, where you really have to unpack it and almost like in some ways relearn all the lessons that we've learned over designing like the US democracy, for example, but then figure out like where does the crypto component sit there, and how is the game going to be 90% the same, but like the 10% is that it's different. How is it going to be different, and how are we going to leverage that successfully?
Yeah. One other thing that I was thinking about while you guys were discussing this also was like the Friends with Benefits token, which I was asked to comment on this. Well, I won't say who it was for in case they don't want me to reveal, but it was like, what do you think the future of money is or whatever? And I was like, I think it's going to get a lot weirder, and it's going to be a lot more tied to your identity and interests. Because, if I look at things like, the Bored Ape Yacht Club or Friends with Benefits, like it just feels like, it's like you just have this kind of like group that you hang out with, and then you all have this identity is represented by this token, and in a way it does end up sort of being like a popularity contest, I think. But anyway, oh my god, you guys, I had so many questions we did not even get to. There's just like so much we could discuss on this, so we should totally redo this at some point later next year, because the rest of my calendar for 2021 is filled out. But this was so fun. Where can people learn more about each of you and your work? And if you have any recommendations on resources for tokenomics, let us know.
Well, for me, you can just go to the Bison Trials website. On our blog, we publish a lot of stuff there. Or just follow me on Twitter. Just my first name, last name, ViktorBunin, Viktor Bunin. And my piece of advice is for folks that are interested in this space, make sure you get the basics. And so the Internet of Money, volumes 1 through 3 by Andreas Antonopoulos, is an incredible resource that really lays down the foundation upon which so many of the things that Yan and I talked about are laid. So highly recommend giving that a read.
Yeah, you can find out more about Delphi at our website, delphidigital.io. We, subscribe. We send out a lot of free content as well. And so feel free to join there. And then you can follow me on Twitter. Also, first name, last name is my handle.
Perfect. Well, thank you both so much for coming on Unchained.
Yeah, thanks so much for having us.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for joining us today. To learn more about Yan, Viktor, and Tokenomics, check out the show notes for this episode. Unchained is produced by me, Laura Shin, with help from Anthony Yoon, Daniel Ness, and Mark Murdoch. Thanks for listening.